The question that I get asked more than anything else is, how do I read so much and how do I remember so much of what I read? It comes down to these three things on the left: the psychology of memory, self-motivation around reading, and the day-to-day logistics of consumption and use of audio. I'm going to add chapter breakdowns for these below. Let's get into it, and we'll start with one particular example with 8 little letters. One of the first videos that I made was about exercise and how exercise can make you smarter. Specifically, cardio exercise can make your rate of neurogenesis increase via a chemical called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I said that was a lot of fancy words, but saying that differently, when you exercise, you create chemicals in your brain that actually allow you to make more neurons. If you went to school around the same time that I did or before, you were taught that the number of neurons that you had in your brain was fixed. You were stuck with one amount of neurons, and it was just like if you drank some alcohol, you decrease your number of neurons, and it's over. It's just over for that neuron. This is wrong. We know now that there's this thing called neurogenesis. There's this thing called neuroplasticity. Your brain can grow and build new neurons over time. But how quickly it builds new neurons isn't entirely random. And in fact, if you do cardio exercise and you get your heart rate into the right regions, and the details are documented in this book that should be flashing on the screen, Spark by John Rady, who I've read two other books by, incidentally, so getting down to our third tip there, that allows you to increase your rate of neurogenesis. So the very first bonus tip that isn't even really meant to be on this list at all is that if you exercise before you read, you will remember more of what you read. You can read this book for details about why. But that's a pre-tip, that's a bonus tip that wasn't in there. The reason I'm even talking about BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is because I remember that acronym, even though I read that book I don't know, my second year in New York, years ago, I read this book. But that acronym and that concept is still in my brain. Why? For a lot of reasons. One, it was personal to me at the time. Two, I was never a person that really exercised much. And so it was a change in my lifestyle. But the main reason that I remember is because memory is associative. And those 4 letters, B, D, N, F, are in my brain associated with another set of 4 neuroscience letters that I have locked into my brain for another reason, which is the RTPJ, the right temporal parietal junction. This is a region of your brain that is associated with Rebecca Sachs, the neuroscientist who introduced me to this concept via her TED Talk, is mind reading, not like telepathy mind reading, but the part of your brain that tells you, that predicts and projects what it thinks other people are thinking. I watched her TED Talk something like 8 or 9 years ago, and I absolutely was obsessed with this concept, and so I quizzed myself. This is literally the second tip, which is quiz yourself, which is so boring and so basic, and I wish that it could be different. I wish remember more of what you read could include more steps in it. Well, I'll tell you more about it, but I quizzed myself on RTPJ, right temporal parietal junction, a bunch of times until I remembered the mind reading center of the brain is called the RTPJ. And the way that I remembered it has to do with the details of our TED Talk and when children develop this particular instinct to mind read. We're not born with it. It develops over time. And that particular acronym just stuck with me and stayed with me. And as a weird quirk, because I happen to know that acronym, now I get to hook other things to that acronym. Memory is not like a bucket into which you can put things. It's much more like a tree or a bunch of neurons, right? It's connected, it's associative. And so the more that you do remember, the more that you can remember. Your mind doesn't get cluttered by adding more stuff to it. You get to remember more by remembering more. It's a self-fulfilling, amazing prophecy. So I start with the BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and endothelial growth factor, and the other ones that are in the book, not because exercise is the way that I remember all that I read and the way that I read so much. It's not. But instead, because it is an example of how I committed one thing to memory like 8 or 9 years ago, or whenever I saw that TED Talk, like long enough ago that I don't even remember when it was. It might even have been in college. Um, but because I but because I committed that one thing to memory way back then, I know that I know it and I can hook other things to it in an associative way. So I hope that teases you a little, that gets you hooked in a little bit more. There's way more tips that we're going to work through in this outline. Um, I'm Charlie. This is That Makes Sense to Me. Welcome to this channel, and I can't wait to get into it. I want to start at the beginning by skipping to the end, which is asking the question of the logistics of consumption. And one of the things that I do that not a lot of people say is a good idea, I don't know, but it's a good idea to me, and here's why, is I always read more than one book at a time. I know some people, like, their brains work that they can only do one at a time, and if that's you, like, cool, figure out a system for how to make that work. That is not how my brain works at all. And part of the reason why I actually recommend to people to read more than one book at a time is because in the self-motivation chapter, right? Don't judge yourself about abandoning books. You shouldn't get fixated on one book as if it is the end-all, be-all, most important book in the world. There are more books being published every year than you will ever read in your lifetime. And so the ability to like stick to a book and commit to it, like maybe there's seasons in your life when you want to develop that self-discipline, but most of the time, if your intuition is screaming at you, leave this book alone. It is boring, it is useless, it is not helpful to you, it is not entertaining, and it's not providing value, and you don't have to read it for homework, just drop it. I don't know if no one's ever told you this before, but like you are not a failure if in the process of reading a book, you come to realize that it is not worth your time and energy, it's not helping you, and you should just say goodbye to it like swiping left on a Tinder date. You should do that. That's part of what's going to make you a good reader is like knowing what you can actually even get through in the first place. People will give me fiction recommendations. They're hard for me to get through. I'm not a literary person. I mostly focus on nonfiction because that's one of my strengths. And you should focus on your strengths and like enjoy the process of reading. And if you're constantly forcing yourself to read books that you hate, you're not going to enjoy the process of reading. And so you're going to give up pretty soon. The other thing is, I often will read with a purpose, and that matters. I'm writing one of my own books. I talk about this on my TikTok channel. I talk about this on my Instagram. I'm talking about it more on YouTube. I will pick up a book knowing that there's something in it that I am interested in learning about. And most of the time, I'm right and I'm wrong in that I'm right that what I needed is in that book, but I'm also wrong in that there's so many more things in that book, right? Which brings me to the second one, which is read without a purpose. Like maybe you're just really curious about a thing and you want to pick up a book and you're like, oh, that looks cool. Follow your nose. Follow your nose. Follow your intuition. Trust yourself. Trust your interest, right? Reading is meant to be pleasurable. And we live in there was the printing press, right, which changed the game for how books were distributed and what reading meant and what like literature meant, education generally construed. We live in a not just post-internet world, but post-Facebook world, post-TikTok world, post-Twitter, post-insurrection, post-Cambridge Analytica, post-Brexit. There's more information out there than you could ever possibly consume. So sometimes you want to read with a purpose and you want to be targeted, and other times you want to let yourself be curious and just follow your nose and follow your joy and your pleasure. And like, if you are not finding reading enjoyable, no frickin' way are you going to turn into a reader over like the long-term scale of your life. Cool. And then to hammer that point in on the psychology of self-motivation and on self-motivation, right? Reading, if you are enjoying it rather, can become part of your identity as a person. I read James Clear's book Atomic Habits, and then I read it a second time, and there's a lot in that book that's great. I'm kind of you're hearing my James Clear's book on Atomic Habits. It's one of the most cited books on the internet, which makes me suspicious of it intrinsically because I have like a little bit of a hipster like instinct, or rather like when something is massively popular, it either part of me thinks like it must not be challenging enough people or like there must be something about it that's like got some confirmation bias associated with it. That's probably not always true, right? Some things are popular because people need them and they're good and yada yada yada. I should get over myself. But one of the things in James Clear is like book Atomic Habits is if your identity is smoker or someone who's trying to quit smoking or like not a smoker, that changes your behavior. So if you can identify as a reader, it will change your self-perception and it will change your reading habits. So like, what are things that you can do that help you identify as a reader? Is it reading first thing in the morning? Not for me, because I'm scrolling TikTok. I've been trying to fight that battle my whole damn life and I keep losing. So I gave up and I just let myself scroll YouTube, Instagram, whatever, a little bit in the morning, and life goes on. But I often will read over coffee. Or over breakfast. That's a thing that a reader does, right? The other thing is the stickies, like putting those sticky tabs on everything, putting the notes in the front of, like, I'm getting back to the psychology of memory bit, but those are not just things that help me remember. They're also signals to myself. They're votes for your identity, as James Clear says. Those are votes for the identity that, like, I'm a nerdy kind of person that enjoys reading. And you can relish those things and you can enjoy them, and that's fine. But I haven't talked at all about the psychology of memory. I've only been talking about self-motivation and logistics of consumption. So let me do this, which is say one more thing about consumption, which is I am not only always reading more than one book at a time, I often end up reading more than one book by the same author. And that, I've noticed over years, is a really interesting way to move through the world, because a book feels so polished and finished and perfect and on like an intellectual pedestal, at least for somebody like me who aspires to write books. I see a book and I'm like, a book. I like to annotate books specifically to be like, it's just somebody's thoughts. They worked hard on them. I should respect them, but not revere them. As respect but not revere is a mantra that came out of my physics education that like matters to me. And part of what happens when you read more than one book by the same author is you get to see them grow as an author over the course of the pages. You get to see them have different thoughts in different places. You will see the entire introduction to the second book written in like 2 or 3 condensed paragraphs at the end, and you can see them baking the ideas in their heads. And those kinds of connections are themselves memorable. A silly example that I've made other videos about, it's not 2 books, but the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech is actually the second at bat that guy took with that speech, right? The Freedom Rally at Cobo Hall speech is draft 1, and then he took that and then he made it into the better one. So reading more than one attempt by the same author at a complex set of ideas can be really, really interesting in helping solidify things, because it builds and it builds and it builds that concept of connecting and building connections across things. So with that, we'll sort of make a hard transition into the psychology of memory, and then we'll call this video a wrap. Okay, so first thing about psychology of memory is actually going to be this concept of interleaving. If you spend 3 hours studying for an exam, the day before the exam, it will not be as effective as if you spent 3 hours on the 3 days leading up to the exam. Why is this? Lots of reasons. Getting to sleep on it, getting to see it in different contexts, getting to see it repetitiously with these spaced. But spacing out your study intrinsically is going to lead to better recall, just as like a matter of psychological baseline understanding of how memory works, as has been taught to me by psychology professors over the years. This, if you'll see on my little diagram, like has a squiggly dotted line to reading more than one book at a time, because reading more than one book at a time allows spacing in between study sessions. So like I will get to naturally build in these breaks and I'll see slices of a book over time. But the real reason, the real meat of why I love to read more than one book at a time is it allows me to make connections across different texts. And more than anything else, those connections help me remember both texts. So let's start with an example. Remember the BDNF RTPJ connection? That is a 2-directional connection. Every time I think of one, I think of the other. Every time I try to recall one, I recall them both, and it strengthens the memory of them both, and I just hold on to them all the more. An example of that comes from Dr. Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, and it's this little formula that's written at the top of the page, like somewhere. I also, like, spatial reasoning is a strength of mine, so I try to remember, like, how thick into the book. So it's about 2/3 of the way into the book in the top right. So that will help me to But that is a predictive policing algorithm that is being sold. Um, I also remember the predictive policing algorithm because I hooked it to another policing and judge related algorithm called the Compass algorithm that got rebranded as the North Point algorithm. So Predpol and North Point get held in Predpol and North Point get held in my brain with this same kind of bidirectional memory connection. Um, but what I do beyond that is then I branch out each of those things, and each of those things allows me to connect them even more. So these gestures are not going to communicate everything, but for the sake of just explaining this example, there's a book called Just Mercy that was made into a movie by Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson is one of my intellectual and social heroes that exists right now. He has brought cases to the Supreme Court and had laws changed on a national level for the sake of just criminal justice reform. So, sorry, I've had to start and restart this portion of the video a whole bunch of times. It's a very emotional case, and I have a lot of reasons for this case being emotional, not all of which I'll explain in this video. The case of Jimmy Dill was a case where someone sentenced to be executed wrongfully actually prevailed in the appeals process, more or less. Again, you can read the details in Bryan Stevenson's book. The TLDR, the big takeaway, was that the courts decided that there would be an option for a plea deal, that if he pled guilty, that they would not execute him. But no one told him that that was going to happen. No one bothered. No one could be pressed to explain this to him. And as a result, Jimmy Dill was executed, even though he didn't need to be, legally speaking. I don't know. I don't want to assume anything about your politics, but like that should probably make you mad, right? That the legal system failed him, and the legal system working through like the process that it had committed to made its way to the point where he didn't need to be killed, but it was too late, and they let it happen anyway. I bring up this case for a couple of reasons. One, because it functions as an example of how emotionally salient things and personally meaningful things, right? This case, honestly, it hits every single one of these three things, right? It's interleaving in that I return to that case a lot. It's interleaving in that it's making connections in that when I read about Dr. Benjamin's predictive policing algorithms that fail, I don't just see a broken policing algorithm, and I don't just see a broken machine. I see a broken machine in the context of the life and death consequences that algorithms like that can have. So it's not just that I'm going to remember that that algorithm is there. It's that I'm going to connect that algorithm to the North Point and Compass algorithm, and I'm going to connect both of those algorithms to the case of Jimmy Dill, or I believe his name's Walter Isaacson. I'm really bad with names, so I apologize if I'm getting some of these wrong. But I know where to find them, so I can cite them and get them right if I'm getting them later. And it also speaks to reading with a purpose, because I picked up Dr. Benjamin's book and I picked up Bryan Stevenson's book in part to come to better understand these social algorithms and these legal algorithms and these police patrol algorithms and prison sentencing algorithms that we have and we are using now in like 30 states in the United States. I don't know if you knew this, but like there's like 30 states in the United States that are using prison sentencing algorithms to help judges make decisions about who is a risky person and who is not. Spoiler alert, they're racially biased. And I should also say that, like, to tie it all together, to just try to make this into a coherent narrative here, right? In the logistics of consumption, I started reading Bryan Stevenson's book, and I had to put it down a lot because it was so emotional. And there's several books that are like that, where I have to pick them up, put them down, and pick them up and put them down. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, with needing to take the time, and despite the fact that I will read a lot, and I'll read a lot of different books at the same time, sometimes a book is serious enough that it requires all your attention. And so I put this on here. I think I deleted it. Yeah, read using a system. Read without using a system. Sometimes in your life, there's going to be seasons where your reading habit is absolutely core to your priorities and your time spent and your whatever, and you got these systematized goals, and you got these numbers that you're trying to meet, and these page numbers per day, and these hours per day, and all these things. And then there's going to be other times in life where a book like Just Mercy comes around, and it shakes the foundations on which your identity stands. And I think part of what makes you a good reader is not just reading a whole lot of books, but giving a book like that the time of day to shake your identity to its very core. Because there's nothing more memorable than growing, than changing, and then becoming a better version of yourself as a result of the books that you read. Great. I'm feeling really heavy now because I'm thinking about Stevenson's book, and I'm thinking about the movie Just Mercy, where they depict a version of this. And it made me cry when I read the book, and it made me cry when I watched the movie. There's a lot of broken systems in the world, and learning about them and reading about them and remembering them is part of how we break them down. So with that, I'm realizing that I missed one core thing, and that one core thing is that I actually also simultaneously physically read books and listen to the audiobook at the same time. But we're going to talk about why I do that in another video, because I'm at the 30-minute mark on my camera. It's gonna die soon. So thank you all for listening. I will be making more videos about that. I will also link, if you liked this video, I'll try to link the Spark video from like a million years ago, and you can laugh at how horrible I was at making videos in the past. And say subscribed, thank you. And I should also say, because I'm out of the habit of doing this, but I'm going to flash my Patreon supporters' names on the screen. I'm too small of a TikToker. I know 150,000 doesn't feel small, but I'm too small of a TikToker to be getting big sponsorships right now. So my Patreons are absolutely clinching the deal. If you want to buy any of these books that I mention, there are links below that will bring you to the Amazon store, where I have affiliate links associated with that. So those will support my channel too. With that, thank you for watching. My name's Charlie. This is That Makes Sense to Me. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.